The first time I saw the monster in my son's bedroom, my blood ran colder than the midnight air. It wasn't a shape, not really. It was a silence that had taken form, a blot of deeper darkness in the corner, where the glow from the dinosaur nightlight refused to reach. It was the absence of something where something should be, and that nothingness was somehow alive. It whispered, not in words, but in sensations, a slick, oily feeling of pure malice that slid directly into my mind. I stood frozen in the doorway, a sippy cup of water forgotten in my hand, my knuckles turning white against the painted wood of the doorframe. 4-year-old Leo slept peacefully, his chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm, his beloved stuffed triceratops, Spike, tucked securely under his arm. He was an island of innocence in a sea of encroaching shadow, completely unaware of the terrifying presence that leached the warmth from his room. This wasn't a dream. The sharp bite of the doorframe into my palm, the frantic drumming of my own heart, they were all too real. This was my new, horrifying reality. The pediatrician, Dr. Evans, a man with a kind face and tired eyes, had a label for it. Night terrors, Clara, he'd said, his voice soothing and condescending. Especially common in children Leo's age. Their imaginations are blossoming, and the line between fantasy and reality is wonderfully, terrifyingly thin. He'd offered a pamphlet with cartoon monsters being chased away by a beam of light. My husband, Mark, had stood behind me, a reassuring hand on my shoulder. See, honey, it's perfectly normal. But his hand felt heavy, and his words felt scripted. Normal didn't explain the way the air in Leo's room grew thick and cold, how the hair on my arms would stand on end the moment I crossed the threshold after dark. Normal didn't account for the whispers that felt like spiders crawling up my spine. I tried the nightlights, a whole army of them, casting a kaleidoscope of stars and dinosaurs that only served to make the shadows in the corners longer and more menacing. I concocted a monster repellent spray from lavender essential oil and water, and we dutifully spritzed it under the bed and in the closet every night. Leo would giggle, his little face lit with trust, but his laughter would die in his throat when we opened the bedroom door, as if the joy itself was being sucked out of him by the waiting silence. I even called Father Macready from St. Augustine's, a gentle old man who had baptized Leo. He walked through the room, sprinkling holy water and murmuring prayers. He left looking not triumphant, but deeply troubled. The room feels heavy, Clara, he'd admitted on the doorstep, his brow furrowed. But sometimes the heaviness isn't a spiritual one. Sometimes it's a reflection of a burden carried by those inside. He'd glanced past me, into the house where Mark was watching television, and I felt a strange, unspoken question hang in the air. Mark became my greatest skeptic and my greatest source of doubt. "You're letting your imagination run away with you, Clara," he'd say, his voice a carefully modulated blend of concern and condescension. "You're stressed. With my travel and Leo, you're projecting. You're seeing your own fears in his room." He started suggesting I see someone, a therapist, just to talk, honey, for your own peace of mind. He'd buy me books on mindfulness and anxiety, leaving them on my nightstand like prescriptions. The gaslighting was so subtle, so expertly woven into the fabric of our daily lives, that I started to question my own sanity. Was I the problem? Was I the monster, infecting my son with my own unspoken terrors? The evidence, however, was in my son's fading light. Leo, my vibrant chatterbox boy, began to retreat into a shell. At preschool, his teacher, Miss Amy, pulled me aside. "He's just not himself, Clara. He doesn't engage in play anymore. He just sits and watches the other children, as if he's waiting for something." At home, he'd cling to my leg, a silent, trembling barnacle. He stopped talking about dragons and superheroes. Instead, he'd draw pictures with a black crayon, furious, scribbled masses that consumed the entire page. When I asked him what they were, he'd just whisper, "The quiet." His appetite dwindled. The sparkle in his big blue eyes, the eyes he'd inherited from his father, was being slowly extinguished. My sweet boy was being erased, and I was the only witness. I was his sole defender in a war everyone else refused to believe was real. The breaking point? The moment my fear crystallized into a rage so pure it was terrifying, came on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. I was washing dishes, the steam fogging the window over the sink, when I realized I hadn't heard from Leo in a while. A mother's intuition, that primal wire strung taut between heart and child, began to hum a warning. I found him in his room, standing perfectly still before the large window that looked out onto our backyard. The afternoon sun was bright, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. But Leo stood in a patch of shadow, his small shoulders slumped. "The tall man says Daddy isn't coming back," he whispered, his voice flat, hollowed out. My blood went cold. "He says you're next. He says you'll be quiet too." In that moment, something broke inside me. This wasn't an imaginary friend or a bad dream. This was a predator. It was communicating, it was threatening my family, and it was using the absence of my traveling husband as a weapon. That night, I didn't bring a nightlight or a spray bottle. I walked into Leo's room after tucking him in, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I carried a fire poker from the living room fireplace, the cold, solid iron a comforting weight in my sweaty palm. The shadow was there, denser than ever, a swirling vortex of nothingness that seemed to pulse with a low, sub-audible hum that I felt in my teeth. "Get out," I whispered, my voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the silent room. The shadow seemed to coalesce, to focus on me. I felt a wave of such profound hatred and coldness wash over me that my knees buckled. It was feeding on my terror, drinking it in. It began to drift, not towards me, but towards Leo's bed, its form elongating, a tendril of darkness reaching for my sleeping son's forehead. I didn't swing the poker. I knew, with a sudden, absolute certainty, that iron and anger were not the weapons for this fight. This thing fed on fear and conflict. It thrived in the space between us. So I did the only thing it could not comprehend. I dropped the poker. It clattered loudly on the hardwood floor, a shockingly mundane sound. I walked to Leo's bed, my legs trembling, and I gathered his warm, sleeping body into my arms. I sat on the edge of his little race car bed, turning my back squarely on the monstrosity in the corner. I put a physical barrier, my own body, between the shadow and my child. And then I began to sing. My voice was a broken, cracking thing at first, barely a whisper. It was the lullaby my own mother had sung to me, a simple, melodic tune about morning bells and silver springs. I closed my eyes and poured everything into it. I sang of Leo's first steps, his gummy, toothless smile. I sang of the way he'd say, "I love you, Mommy," with his small arms wrapped tightly around my neck. I sang of summer days at the park, of blowing dandelion wishes, of the sheer, unadulterated joy that was the core of his being. I built a fortress around us, not of stone and mortar, but of memory and love. The cold intensified, biting through my clothes. The whispering became a furious, sibilant hiss that scraped at the edges of my mind, promising oblivion. But I didn't turn around. I just held my son, my face buried in his soft hair, and I sang. I sang until my throat was raw, until the song was the only thing that existed in the universe. And then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, the cold began to recede. The oppressive weight in the room lightened, as if a physical burden was being lifted. The hissing faded, replaced by the familiar, gentle creaks of our old house settling. I felt a warmth on my back, not the malevolent heat of anger, but the gentle, life-giving warmth of the morning sun beginning to peek over the horizon and through the window. I dared, finally, to look over my shoulder. The corner was empty. Just a simple sunlit room with a scattered pile of Legos and a small, red toy truck. The monster was gone. A profound, weary peace settled over me, so heavy and welcome that tears of exhaustion and relief streamed down my face. I had faced it. I had won. I had protected my son with the one weapon it couldn't withstand, a mother's unconditional, ferocious love. Leo stirred in my arms, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at me, and for the first time in months, his gaze was clear, unclouded by fear. He smiled, a small, sleepy smile that lit up his whole face. "Mommy," he said, his voice soft and sure, no longer a hollow whisper. "The tall man is gone. He said you were too bright to look at." He snuggled deeper into my embrace, his little body relaxing completely, and fell back into a deep, peaceful sleep. I held him there as the sun fully rose, washing the room in a clean golden light, banishing every last remnant of the darkness. The monster was defeated. We were safe. But the true battle, the one I hadn't even known I was fighting, had only just begun. The real enemy was still out there, and he was about to walk through the front door. A week later, the sound of a key turning in the lock was like a gunshot in our newfound peace. The front door swung open, and the familiar sound of his suitcase wheels rolling on the entryway tile made my stomach clench. "Honey, I'm home. Sorry the conference in Chicago ran long. The client was a nightmare." My husband, Mark, stood there, smiling his perfect, handsome smile, his arms open wide for a hug. He looked the same tailored suit, same artfully messy brown hair, same confident posture. But I saw him now with new eyes. Leo, who had been sitting at the kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture of a smiling sun, a stark contrast to his previous black scribbles, flinched violently. His blue crayon skittered across the floor. He didn't run to his father. He didn't even look at him. He looked at me, his small face pale, his eyes wide with a fear I knew intimately. It was the same paralyzing terror he had for the shadow, and in that one horrifying, crystalline moment, the final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with a force that stole the air from my lungs. The monster had never been in the corner. It had been a psychic echo, a manifestation of the true poison in our home. The shadow was a premonition given form, a warning written in the language of dread. The late-night business trips that always seemed to coincide with a deepening of the presence in Leo's room. The life insurance policy he'd pressured me to increase just 6 months ago, joking, "Just in case one of us gets hit by a bus, honey." His constant, subtle suggestions that I was unstable, that I was seeing things, that I needed help. The way he'd always change the subject when I tried to talk seriously about Leo's fear. The shadow wasn't a demon from some netherworld. It was the shadow of my husband's intent. It was the darkness in his heart, so vile and calculating that it had leaked out into the physical world, taking root in the place his son felt most vulnerable. It had been feeding on Leo's innocence, feeding on my sanity, all in preparation for something final. My husband hadn't been away on a business trip. He had been away planning. and now he was home to finish the job. He smiled at me, but his eyes, those beautiful blue eyes he'd given to our son, were as cold and dead as the heart that beat in his chest. The monster wasn't gone. It was standing in my foyer.